What was your beginnings in these kind of areas? What started you off in having the interest to search for this kind of thing?
I
Because I
woke
know
up
that
when I
it's
was 24. I was in New York. I was a screenwriter. I'd just gotten out of the Army in the Vietnam period. And I went to a party that Truman Capote gave. And as I was walking down the hall, I went down to go to the bathroom. And as I came back, I walked by this antique Italian mirror. And I looked at myself in the mirror and I said very spontaneously and to my own surprise, you are becoming an unattractive person. Your values are screwed up. And I left the party and slept on the beach and went into Manhattan the following morning and got in my car and drove back, left New York and drove back to Virginia, where I'm from, and I lived in rural Tidewater, Virginia, down on the Chesapeake Bay. And one day I was sitting there on the porch and I looked up and there was this middle-aged couple. I was then 23 and a half. There was this middle-aged couple walking in my mother's gardens, which were about 17 acres. So it was a property that had several hundred acres. And the woman walked, they saw me looking at them and the woman walked over and I opened the screen door to let them into the porch and that he looked vaguely familiar and the first thing she said to me was, do you believe in reincarnation? Before she even introduced herself, that was the first thing she said. And I said, I grew up in a family that was utterly uninvolved with any kind of religion at all. And I thought about it for a second and said, well, I don't know very much about it, but it sounds very symmetrical to me. So yes, I probably do. And she said, do you know who Edgar Cayce is? And I said, no. And I said, wait, but before we get to that, who are you? And they introduced themselves. Turned out he was a production designer in a rather successful film called the Seven Samurai. I think, wait a minute, is that right? Seven Samurai? Seven. Anyway, I had met him at a film festival. I didn't know him, but we'd shaken hands. And I said to her, why are you here? How did you get here? And she said, well, I had a dream that told me to come up and invite you down to Virginia Beach. And I'm supposed to introduce you to Edgar Cayce. And that was so weird that I just didn't know what to do with that. And she asked me for my telephone number. And just as she did that, a bunch of a green Ford station wagon came down my road. And there was a young couple in it. And I gave her my telephone number and they drove away. And I thought, what the hell just happened? And about a week later, I got a call from a guy and he invited me down to Virginia Beach. And I went down to Virginia Beach, which was about 2 hours away from where I lived in Gloucester. And a young woman was there waiting for me. And she took me up to the ARE and explained to me what she understood about the ARE. And we went into the library. And she said, well, these are all of Edgar Cayce's readings. And there were all these green 3-ring binders, like school binders. And she said, those are all the readings. I said, how many of them are there? And she said, well, I don't know, about 15,000. And at random, I just pulled one off the shelf and opened it up, and it made my hair stand on end, because it was a reading given in 1936 for a woman, and it told her that she had been a member of the Essene community at Khirbet Qumran, where she had been a teacher of astrology. And I had worked for, before I got drafted, I worked for National Geographic. And the first article I had done for them was about, or not the first, the last, before I went into the service, the last article I did for them was about the Dead Sea Scrolls. And I knew that in 1936, nobody knew that Khirbet Qumran existed or that the Essene community lived there. And it was thought that the Essenes were a schismatic order of Jewish men, and that no women were involved. And yet the excavation of, well, in 1947, 11 years after he had given the reading, a young Bedouin tribes boy who was chucking rocks into a cave heard a clunk, and that's how they discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls. And the scrolls established that these ruins were in fact Essene, and excavation revealed that women were involved, and the scrolls themselves are obsessed with astrology. And so I asked myself, as I was standing there in the library, how in the world could this man have gotten this information in 1936? Where was it to go get? And how did he do it?
Yes, absolutely.
So that started me on what became 5 years of reading all of the Edgar Cayce readings from start to finish, and everything ever published on the field of parapsychology.
Did you come at this, because I imagine when you first started there was, as there is now, a lot of skepticism around these kind of what people would call mystical kind of experiences and mystical writings and things. Did you approach it with a skeptical attitude, and did you find a lot of resistance to your research going forward?
By the time I was finished reading the Cayce readings, I didn't have any doubt that it existed. So I wasn't really very interested in that. And as I said, I started reading after 3 years of reading the readings. It took me about 5 years to read them. I decided I wanted to know what science had to say about this, so I started reading from the beginning. Again, I'm very methodical. I started with the very first article in the very first journal on parapsychology, and I read everything that had been published up to that time, which is about 1966. In 1968, I started experimenting. And I started out because I realized from the Cayce readings that all the senses reported. I created a grid in my back garden that started out as 12, a grid of 12 squares, and I outlined it with yellow ship's rope. And then it became 144 squares. And I would bury things in mason jars or film canister, 35 millimeter film canisters. And I would send out mimeographed forms with the drawing of the grid. And I would ask people to locate which grid I had buried the bottle or whatever it was, and
square.
And if they could locate it, then describe it for me. And I found out people could do that. And so that's how I started experimenting. And I read all of the transcendentalist stuff, and Gurdjieff and Uspensky and Steiner and Blavatsky and Bailey and Ledbetter and all of the sort of metaphysical 19th century, early 20th century metaphysical stuff. And I thought it was interesting from an anthropological point of view. But anyway, I started experimenting, and because I wanted to see if other people could do some variant of what Casey was doing, and discovered that they could. Maybe not as well as he could do it, but they could do it. And because I came out of an anthropological orientation, I was reading in the various journals that in archaeology that the big struggle was where to dig, because most archaeological sites at that time were found serendipitously. You know, a farmer plowing in a field discovered a tomb, or a road crew building a highway turned up a temple or something.
Yeah, happened upon it by chance.
And so that was perfect from my point of view, because it allowed me to design experiments that were unimpeachably triple blind. Everybody agreed that they knew where something was, that something existed, but they also agreed they didn't know where it was. And so if you could find it with what I originally called distant viewing, and you could not only locate it, but describe what would be there when you went there, that you had pure triple blind conditions, and therefore you could create an unimpeachable chronology of prediction and then field work and discovery. So I started doing that. And the first one I did was the talking idol of Ixchel in Cozumel Island in Mexico. And then my wife got pregnant, and I needed to make more money. And I went back to Washington, D.C., and I ended up becoming the special assistant to the chief of naval operations. And while I was there, a friend of mine who was the head of the CIA, I never worked for the government because I wouldn't do classified research, began sending me papers written by a guy named Leonid Vasiliev in the Soviet Union. And Vasiliev was trying to answer what was then one of the most important questions in consciousness research, and that is it electromagnetic? And he had put people in mine shafts and down in caves and put them in Faraday cages in the mine shafts or the caves to shield from electromagnetic radiation. And he eventually got it down to ELF, 3 to 300 hertz. And Vasiliev said in these documents that they would get, and I don't know where they got them, but they would send me translations. And he finally got to a point where he realized that he had eliminated all of the EM spectrum except ELF. And he tried to get, the only way you could shield from ELF was seawater at great depth. And he tried to do an experiment. I went to Admiral Gorshkov, who was the head of who created the Soviet Blue Water Navy, to do the experiment, and he couldn't do it. Gorshkov wouldn't do it. I don't know why. And I read this, and as it happened, the Navy had spent $125 million because they got interested in ELF as a way to communicate with the deep missile submarines and deep ocean missile submarines. So they'd spent a great deal of money figuring exactly how deep you had to go, and also the bit rate of transmission, how much information you could put across. And it turns out with ELF, you can get very, very little information. If you saw the movie The Search for Red October, you may remember the scene in which they get this signal, and it's like 1, 2, 3, 4, and they go to a book and they open it up, and 1, 2, 3, 4 means target a particular city. And that actually is how it's done today. But in any case, I realized that submarine was the way to go. Vasiliev was right, because the Project ELF, or Project Sanguine as it came to be known, had proved that that he was correct. And I went to, as it happened, a little while later, I was flying up to Groton, Connecticut for the launch of a new submarine, missile submarine. And I flew up with John Warner, who was Secretary of the Navy, who asked me to come along. And on the plane was Hyman Rickover, who created the nuclear navy. And I asked him if he would let me do this experiment that Vasiliev had described. And he thought about it, and he called me a couple of weeks later, or a week later, and said, you know, that's a really interesting experiment, but no, I'm not going to do it. And I said, why not? And he said, well, because the media will get hold of it inevitably. And they'll talk about the deep ocean missile submarines, and we don't want to do that. So I thought, well, it's never going to happen. And then a couple of years later, I left government. I walked away from a career in government because of Watergate, and I knew all the people involved with Watergate. And I had written some speeches for Nixon. And I just didn't want to be in government because I couldn't tell the good guys from the bad guys, and I just couldn't operate like that. So I left. I resigned my position and went out to. By then, I was doing a lot of what I still call distant viewing. Remote viewing is a term coined in the early 70s by Ingo Swann. That's the one that stuck. It's a terrible term, as is distant viewing, because it has nothing to do with viewing. It has nothing to do with remote or distance. But in any case, that's what we knew at the time. So I went out and wrote a book called The Secret Vaults of Time, which is about all the archaeological work using remote viewing prior to my becoming involved. Because I wanted to know what anyone had done before me. So I wrote this book, and then I got offered a fellowship in Los Angeles. And I went out to Los Angeles, and I stayed with a friend of mine who had been the deputy director of Navy Labs. And he and another friend of mine had retired from the Navy and had taken over the Institute of Marine and Coastal Studies at the University of Southern California. And when I was staying with him, he said, you know that funny submarine experiment you wanted to do? And I said, oh, yeah, sure. And he said, well, as it happens, we have a small research submersible that is coming down to do its sea trials at our Catalina Island facility. And we'll pay for 3 days to do that experiment. We'd like to see how it comes out. And that became a project called Deep Quest, and you can see it. I made a movie out of it. I got Dr. Spock, Leonard Nimoy, to do the narration. And I sent out a sea chart, and I asked 11 remote viewers to locate a previously unknown wreck on the seafloor and to describe what would be there if we went to that site. We did go to that site, and we did find it. And it was exactly as they described it, down to the little details, the date that it sank, how it sank, why it sank, all of that the remote viewers described turned out to be correct.
Very specific detail. It's
very specific. And the other thing was I had invented what has now come to be called ARV, Associated Remote Viewing. And I created that protocol because I wanted to see if you could communicate. You could send a communication that could be, let me say that in doing all of this research, I had learned that analytical things like names or numbers are not very easy for remote viewers to get. But you could create an association so that, for instance, a pear represented a particular message and a pair of scissors represented another message. And then you could just get somebody to say, I'm going to show you a target. Can you describe it for me? And if it was a pear, then you got that message. And if it was a scissors, it got that message.
Right. So it worked through symbolism.
So I put people at depth, Ingo Swann and Hella Hamid, and I got them to remote view where Russell Targ and Hal Puthoff. I had just met the SRI guys, literally. I mean, it was like a week before, because they were the only other people that were doing anything like this, and so I asked the reviewers to remote view where they were hiding. They were able to do it. And they were able to do it when they were at depth. So if you think about it, first of all, the remote viewers who were scattered all over the world were able to penetrate the seawater down to the sea floor and describe the wreck. And then I could put them at depth and get them to reach out from the seawater to where people were hiding somewhere in Northern California. And they could do that as well. So clearly it could not be ELF. And therefore, remote viewing is not an electromagnetic phenomenon, which was, as I say, a big question at the time in 1972. A guy named Michael Persinger at Laurentia University had written what had become a very well-studied paper arguing that it was ELF, that it could only be ELF. And I mean, this all seems very dated, but at the time, people thought what they were looking at was an electromagnetic phenomenon. If you think about it, telephony, telegraphy, telepathy.
Yeah,
I mean, people,
reasonable.
Their original conception of what was happening was that there were senders and receivers and signals.
Yes.
Like a PM, like a radio, like a walkie-talkie. And what the Deep Quest experiment showed, and you can go up to YouTube or go to my personal website, StephanASchwartz.com, and you can watch the movie Deep Quest. You can see it happen. And that began what became, I founded a lab called Mobius. And Mobius did remote viewing and consciousness research for the next 30 years. And I did archaeological projects all over the world. And then I got interested in healing, and I showed that people who expressed therapeutic intention could change this molecular structure of water in an unimpeachable way. And I looked at, is there a particular personality configuration that makes people better than other people? No, there isn't, except that right brain people do better than left brain people. And I began to realize from the research I was doing that the key to opening to non-local consciousness is the ability to attain and sustain intention-focused awareness, and that's why meditators routinely do better than non-meditators, and why they teach meditation in martial art dojos in Japan or Tibetan lamaseries in Tibet, or Buddhist temples in India or whatever. All of these religions have figured this out, that the way you open to non-local consciousness is you have to be able to attain and sustain intention-focused awareness, so that the neurological stimulus that normally takes up most of your thinking, it's hot, it's cold, it's light, it's dark, it's noisy, it's quiet, that fades into the background, and you can open to this non-local aspect of consciousness. Everybody has it. It's a part of, it's fundamental to your nature of being a human being or any other kind of living organism. And that there are two components to it. One is people are born with a particular capacity to do it, just like, some people are born being really good at playing the piano or playing golf or whatever. In the same way, some people are better at remote viewing. There's an innate ability, and then you have to develop this discipline of attaining and sustaining intention focused awareness. There are lots of ways to do that, but that's how you learn how to express your potential, like any other human skill. And so out of all that research came insights into how this works, what the nature of consciousness is. I began to study things like intention, the role of numinosity, the role of entropic process. So we don't know what the mechanism of consciousness is, how it works, but we do know some variables about how to work with it so that you can increase a person's ability to access it. And when you design an experiment, if you factor in properly things like intention, numinosity, and entropic process, you can get much better results.
Right. So, from everything you've listed there and your history in the phenomena, it seems that it's effectively case closed that there is phenomena that takes place of non-local consciousness, and yet it seems that phenomena such as remote viewing, for want of a better term, is very, very much seen as pseudoscientific and effectively woo-woo nonsense, with various
Well,
skeptics
that's
claiming...
because that's a form of willful ignorance. The reason that consciousness has not been part of science is because of the Council of Trent. Between 1545 and 1563, the Roman Catholic Curia, that was the Roman Catholic Church, was becoming very concerned about the development of science and also the beginning of the Reformation movements. So between 1545 and 1563, they had 25 meetings of the Curia, and they finally issued an edict in which they said, anything that has to do with spirit, read consciousness, that's our world. And anything that has to do with physicality, you guys in science have that. But if you cross over into our world and we get hold of you, we'll torture you and kill you and burn you alive. And that's how the Inquisition got started. And as a result of that, science and consciousness got bifurcated. And for the next several hundred years, until the end of the 19th century, when psychiatry, psychology, anthropology, sociology, parapsychology, all begin within about a 50-year period, because it became clear to researchers that that consciousness had to be included. It was a factor that had to be considered. 1931, Max Planck, the father of quantum mechanics, was asked, "What have you learned?" by a reporter from the Observer newspaper. And he said, "What I've learned is that consciousness is causal and fundamental. You cannot get behind consciousness. Space-time, physical reality, arises from consciousness, not consciousness from physical reality. Consciousness is the fundamental." And Einstein said, consciousness is the fundamental, and that what we call reality is an optical delusion. And Planck and Pauli and Schrodinger and Heisenberg all came to the same conclusion. So when you talk to people who think it's crazy or woo-woo, basically you're talking to people who are willfully ignorant. And I just don't have any interest in it. I'm not, it's a debate that I'm not interested in, because it's a form of ignorance, and I'm not interested in promoting ignorance. So when you talk to people and they tell you this is all woo-woo or it can't exist or any of that, basically you're talking to a person who hasn't bothered to actually look at the data. And the other thing is that it has become clear, if you look at the reincarnation research or the near-death research, that there is continuity of consciousness. That is, consciousness exists prior to incarnation, during incarnation, and after corporeal death.
Mm. How confident do you believe, from all the research combined into one, can we say that we're justified to believe that conclusion?
Well, I don't know. How many thousand experiments do you need?
Yes.
I mean, I just
indeed.
think that's a stupid question, to tell you the truth.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
But it is one that a lot of people
oh, yes,
raise.
absolutely. Yeah, it's an enormous amount of willful ignorance. Of course. You know, I have been on several times, I've been asked to debate people who hold that position. In one occasion, they didn't show up for the debate. In the other one, they got so embarrassed that they left the stage. It's just, I'm not, yes, many people still believe that consciousness arises from biophysiology. Yes, I get it. And that there is no continuity of consciousness, and that there is nothing outside of materialist physics. But that's not even a position that many physicists hold anymore, because what's happening is we are now coming to the culmination that began in the end of the 19th century, in which consciousness is being considered to be fundamental and causal, as Planck told us in 1931.
Yes. Quantum mechanics is often used, or is often seen as any person that proposes consciousness to be, if we take the famous double slit experiment, for instance, the Copenhagen interpretation of that, which states that consciousness collapses the wave function. Many critics of that believe that anybody that comes to that conclusion are essentially misrepresenting many quantum physicists' opinions.
I mean, Darren, again, many people believe that Donald Trump was sent by God to rule America. I mean, what is the response to that? Grotesque ignorance? If you look at the research, that's the point. If you look at the research, there is no question that consciousness is limited to space-time. All of the remote viewing research demonstrates that people can describe things routinely with about 75% accuracy that they just couldn't know normally or through any of their normal senses. And that distance doesn't make any difference, and nor does time. I mean, when someone describes Cleopatra's palace that no one has seen for 2,000 years,
yes. How can you go around that?
How do you get around that? Yes. How do you get around somebody describing where Christopher Columbus's caravel from his fourth voyage is? How do you get around? I mean, there's so many of these experiments. When I talk to people who take the position that you're arguing, and I understand why you're doing that.
And just for the record, I don't hold that. I
didn't
agree
think
completely with you.
No, I understand what you're doing. When you press them, well, I mean, I'll give you an example. Years ago, back in the 80s, ABC Network asked myself and a denier named Dan Dennett and a neuroscientist named Jerry Levy to debate Ed May from SRI and myself. And so you can just picture it happened in Palm Springs in California. So there's like 400 or 500 news people from the network, news managers, reporters, that kind of thing, who are in this hall, and we're having this debate. And so Ed goes first, and he explains what they're doing at SRI. And then Dennett stands up and says, this is all nonsense and blah, blah, blah. Yeah, it's all, all the usual stuff. And so then it's my turn. And I said to him, you have such strong feelings about this that I assume that you have studied it closely in order to develop the position that you've developed. And so why don't, rather than just have this sort of abstract argument, why don't we take a particular study that we both know, and you tell me what you think is wrong with it, and I'll respond. And without thinking, and I'm sure it embarrassed him, without thinking, he immediately said in the most condescending tone, "You don't think I actually read this stuff, do you?" And then there was complete silence in the room, and then there were titters, and then guffaws, and then the whole thing broke down into laughter, and he got up and left.
Yes, yes. He rather lost his credibility there himself, I
Well,
imagine.
I mean, so whenever you hear people say that there is no continuity of consciousness, and that I don't know, mostly the arguments now are about, did you use the right statistics? See, the reason I was attracted to the archaeological work was, first of all, I could use an electronic surveillance technique like ground penetrating radar, proton precession magnetometers, side scan sonars. I could use an electronic search technique to see if you could locate the site electronically. And in every instance, you could not. In every instance, no exception. That one thing. And the other thing was that you didn't have to get into statistics. If somebody describes to you, for instance, in Deep Quest, which I was mentioning to you, the Deep Quest, the remote viewers said it was a sailing ship, but it had a kind of steam engine on the deck, early donkey steam engine, and it blew up and set fire to the ship, and that's why the ship sank. That turns out to be all correct. And they described this thing in great detail, drew up pictures of it. And then Hella Hammond said, oh, and also you're going to find, a large granite block about 5 by 4 by 6. And she drew a picture of it. Now, you could say, well, if you're going to describe a ship and you describe an anchor, well, that may be right, but ships always have anchors. But if you're going to describe a large granite block that's 4 by 5 by 6, you do not expect to hear somebody say that. Or give you another example, we found a ship in the Bahamas, the Beaks Cay, a ship, and people described the ship in great detail, where it was, and we couldn't locate it with side scan sonar, and but it was there as exactly where they put it and exactly as they described it. And they described things down to 5/8 of an inch. They're little glass bottles that had medicine, and said, well, you're going to find this box that's got these little glass vials that are filled with powder. And we did. Or in another case, in Egypt, I was challenged by deniers, and they said I wanted to dive in the Eastern Harbor to find Cleopatra's Palace, Mark Antony's palace, the Lighthouse of Pharos, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. And they said, before we'll let you do that, you have to prove to us that you can actually do something with this. And I said, okay, what do you want? And they said, well, there's a buried city that's gone, it's buried, but that was called Maria. That's about 40 kilometers outside of Alexandria, Egypt. And we want you to locate the city, and we want you to locate a single building in the city, and the single building has to have certain characteristics. And so okay. So we got about 1,700 square kilometers to search. And it took us about 3 hours. And George McMullen, Hella Hammond, they located the building. They staked it out. They put stakes in the ground where the corners were. They said how deep it would be before we would find it, that it was a Christian building, not a Roman building. And that we would find, they had asked us to locate tiles And they said, and you'll find these little red, black, and white tiles, these little tiles. They're about 5/8 of an inch across, and most of them have been taken away, but some of them are still there, and they have plaster on one side and they're shiny and smooth on the other. And all of that completely contradicted what the archaeologists thought. They were convinced the building couldn't possibly be a Christian building, that nobody had ever seen such tiles, and on and on. And all of it turned out to be true. You can watch this happen. Go up to YouTube or go to my personal website, stephanschwartz.com, and you can watch them. You can watch George and Hella locate the building, and you can watch the excavation, and everything that they predicted comes true.
Right.
So it doesn't require statistics.
No, that's far beyond the realm of needing to invoke statistics at all.
Yes.
Just for the depth of it.
And that's why I did it.
Yeah. Yes, certainly. So I want to ask you about something which I can imagine what your answer will be, but I want to ask it because it's a very common rebuttal you hear about this kind of subject, and that is Mr. James Randi and his $1 million prize. That's whenever I mention anything about this arguing for a non-local consciousness or mediumship or near-death critical perception, I'm always meted with, well, no one's ever won the Randi Foundation prize regarding also the SRI experiments with Uri Geller.
That's not a legitimate prize.
Things like that.
The whole thing was a scam. You know how I met James Randi? I knew about him. I was at a conference, Parapsychology Association conference, and this flashy, he looked like some kind of hustler, came up to me and introduced himself as James Randi. He had these what used to be called Burnside, kind of facial hair.
Yeah.
And he began trying to quiz me about the SRI guys.
Mm-hmm.
And I looked over, and I could see flashing in his jacket pocket was this little red light going off and on. And I realized that what he was doing was trying to get me to say something negative about them that he could record. So I reached in his pocket and pulled out his tape recorder and said, "Oh my goodness, you have a tape recorder and you're recording me." And I made the tapes, I reversed the tape, and then I went testing 1 2 3, testing 1 2 3. We were only about 30 seconds into this conversation, and erased everything that had been done, which made him furious, and then handed the recorder back to him. And that's James Randi. The whole thing was a scam. He got a MacArthur Fellowship, sure, because he was willing to do the dirty work that other deniers weren't willing to do. And he created this bogus prize, which nobody ever won because it wasn't a real prize. And I mean, the whole thing was bogus. He was just another grifter who was, he'd found out that you could work his circuit. You could make a career out of being a denier, and other deniers were happy to let you do the dirty work, and they didn't have to put their names into it. And so that's the kind of person he was. What can I tell you?
Yes, and I mean, to his credit, he was very successful at doing it. And
he was successful with certain people. Yeah, I mean, I never took him seriously because he was such an obvious grifter. But yes, people did. Sure.
Yes.
But and, let me also say, what you discover I've also done a great deal of research about why people believe or don't believe. I suggest to you need to look at some work first you need to read Thomas Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions, because Kuhn describes exactly how paradigms change. And you need to look at Dan Kahan's work up at Yale, because he describes why scientists, not the first tier, but the second and third tier scientists, for them, it's much more important that there be group acceptance than that they endorse or even entertain something that is outside of the paradigm. And so that's why most second and third tier scientists don't can be deniers, I guess skeptics. Okay.
Yes, yes, yes.
But if you look at the first tier people, the people that make the breakthroughs, the moments of genius that change things forever, what you find is that they almost universally support the idea of non-local consciousness because they've had non-local consciousness experiences. Poincaré is walking across the street and he has a vision that solves the mathematical problems that he's been working with. Descartes has 3 dreams in Germany in 1619 that change his whole understanding of how geometry and algebra interact. And out of these 3 dreams, he writes his great opus. Tesla is walking across Central Park when he has a vision of the electric motor and goes back to his lab and tells his engineers, this is what I want you to build, not prototype and test, just build me this. And they build it and he turns it on and that's the electric motor. Or you have Einstein says that the general and special theories of relativity came to him after he'd been sick and he was whiling away an afternoon in a canoe. Or you have Jonas Salk, who says, I asked him, where did you get the idea for the polio vaccine? And he said, in a dream. So when you talk to first tier people, what you discover is that moments of genius are just like moments of spiritual epiphany, are just like remote viewing experiences. The difference is in the context and intention. So scientists, their desire is to get insights into how the world works, and that's the kind of experience they have. Spiritual pilgrims are trying to have a transcendent experience. That's the kind of experience they have. And remote viewers are trying to describe the teacup that's hidden in a closet 1,000 miles away, and that's the kind of experience they have. But it's the same experience opening to non-local consciousness.
Yes. So, how long and how best do you think we should approach it, or to phrase the question, I suppose, in a better way, in a non-ridiculous way? How do you think it's best for scientists to approach this phenomena in the most productive way to begin to shift that paradigm to accept this data?
Well, the paradigm is shifting because if you look at the research, for instance, you take a guy like Andrew Newberg, who created neurotheology. I mean, what he discovered was that when people are going through religious services where they're focusing their attention, that all their brains become entrained. Or you look at the work of Jean Achterberg, for instance, who was doing healing studies with kahuna priests in Hawaii. And she discovered that when the priests the kahunas were focusing healing intention on people who were in MRIs, that a very particular part of their brain lit up, and it only happened when they were expressing healing intention. Or you can look at the work of William Browd, who discovered that people, when people are being stared at, even though they don't know they're being stared at, their brains react. I mean, I can just on and on and on. There's a huge corpus of research about this that makes it very clear the reality of non-local consciousness, and particularly the continuity of consciousness. If you look at the work at the University of Virginia started by Ian Stevenson, now being done by Jim Tucker, particularly the research in which they have show that children who had traumatic physical events occur in a previous life are born with birthmarks or scar tissue where that event occurred, or that they can recall things that they couldn't possibly know that turn out to be true. I mean, when you look at it, or you look at, for instance, the near-death research of Pim van Lommel or Bruce Grayson, who show that people who have near-death experiences uh, are brain dead, and they couldn't possibly be having those experiences because their brains are not working. And yet they have these very detailed experiences in which they can describe things that they couldn't possibly know that occurred while they were having a near-death experience. So you can just you go on and on and on, whether it's therapeutic intention, whether it's remote viewing, whether it's near-death experiences. You can look at, for instance, even down to, for instance, I did a study in which I took a bottle of wine and split it into two carafes. I had one carafe be the focus of healing intention, meditation by a group of meditators, and the other be just a control. And then I would give the two carafes to somebody and say, have a party, and I'm going to buy all this wine, and I want to know which of these two wines, it's really one wine, which of these two wines is the best. And in 11 out of 12 cases, they picked the wine that was the subject of focus of meditation. I mean, there's just so much research that
there is
that certainly. Arguing that it doesn't exist is just, I mean, it's absurd. It's just
it's not so much. Yeah, it doesn't seem to be so much arguing that it doesn't occur. It's more arguing that it will be rooted back to some sort of physical mechanism, like you say about the sense of being stared at activates a certain part in the brain, or a certain part of the brain is activated when performing healing. Someone who comes at this from a physicalist point of view will still say, well, that shows you that part of the brain is creating this illusion or whatever it be.
Well, except that when you look at the protocol, that's not possible.
Although it seems they rarely do look.
Well, they don't read the data. Of course, they don't read the research. That's the point.
That's my common experience. Yeah.
Well, the main thing that you find out about deniers and skeptics is their mediocrity, and also there are a lot of ethical issues of people who just don't behave properly.
Yes, especially from the safety of a keyboard, I noticed.
Well, yes, but I mean, they don't bother to read the research, or they don't tell the truth about it. So the main thing that stands out about that kind of stuff is that it's mediocre. It's just shoddy research, shoddy intellectual thought. I mean, you'd look at Daryl Bem's, for instance, Visions of the Future experiment, in which a guy named Wagonmaker attacks him, and then Wagonmaker's, the guy that he cites as the basis for his attack, writes and says, "You've completely misrepresented my work."
So yes, I read that quite recently. That was quite interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it just goes on and on. The hallmark of the denier is mediocrity.
Yes. So how should we, as honest researchers who do dig through this stuff and try to look at it objectively, how should we deal with people like that? Just completely ignore them?
Well, that's more or less what I do. I don't really, I mean, as I said, I've 3 times I've been asked to debate them, and it's absurd. It's like a carnival.
Yeah, it wouldn't really be a debate. It'd be more just talking to a brick wall.
I just don't. Yeah. Now, I will also say, because of the way I do my research, this is important, I guess, I don't get attacked. Nobody's ever attacked my work. Because in order to, I do it, first of all, I do it in front of lots of people. It's witnessed by all sorts of people who are particular experts in whatever it is I'm doing. I film it. I create an unimpeachable chronology. All of the predictive remote viewing material is notarized and turned over to a third party. So there's absolutely no question about that you didn't make it up after the fact, or, whatever, that kind of criticism. So I've never actually been attacked. I don't have a lot of interaction with it. I don't really pay much attention to it. I just find it kind of embarrassing, to tell you the truth, because it's so intellectually shoddy.
Yes, absolutely, I'd agree. And as you say, we have to take all these phenomena, remote viewing, near-death phenomena, terminal lucidity, and others. We have to take them as a whole package. And the fact that they all these phenomena point in one direction shows that there is something that must be seriously considered. And as well, with your research done, in the way it is, in the perfect way, adds an incredible amount to weight to that. And I wish a lot more people were familiar with your work.
Well, I do what I can. I write books, I make films, I publish hundreds of papers. What can I tell you?
Yes. It's just, I suppose it's the stubbornness of those that are insistent that this kind of thing is impossible preemptively.
Yeah. Good for them. I don't care.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Seeking Eye Life Exploration podcast. If you did and would like to continue following my research, please consider subscribing to my YouTube channel and following the podcast on Podbean, iTunes, Spotify, and other podcast providers. You can also join our Facebook discussion group. You can find the link to this and other Seeking Eye online profiles at seeking-eye.com. Thank you.